I had always believed that marriage would bring stability and happiness. Growing up in a loving but modest home, I carried my late parents' values with me: kindness, humility, and resilience. Despite losing them in my teens, their lessons guided me. My husband, Ethan, had swept me off my feet during college, charming, ambitious, and seemingly perfect. At first, his family appeared welcoming. His mother, Eleanor, smiled politely, though her eyes betrayed her true feelings. His father, Gerald, was reserved, but his disapproving glances lingered just long enough to sting. I ignored the warning signs because I loved Ethan. After our wedding, we moved into his family's estate at Eleanor's insistence. She called it a temporary arrangement to help us save for our own home. At the time, it seemed generous. Little did I know, I was stepping into a gilded cage. The changes were subtle at first, barely noticeable. Eleanor often compared me to the wives of their family friends, doctors, lawyers, or wealthy heiresses. You know, Olivia hosted a charity gala for 300 guests all by herself, Eleanor remarked one evening, her tone dripping with admiration. Isn't that impressive, Ethan? It sounds incredible, I replied, forcing a smile. She's a natural, Eleanor continued, her gaze sharp. Not everyone has the upbringing for it. Ethan didn't defend me. He didn't even notice. I told myself it was easier to let such comments slide than risk conflict. But things escalated. Eleanor began treating me less like family and more like hired help. She left daily lists of chores: ironing clothes, polishing silverware, preparing elaborate meals. At first, I complied, hoping to win her approval. No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. One evening, after hours spent crafting a 3-course meal, Eleanor pushed her soup bowl aside with a frown. "It's too salty," she declared. "Redo it tomorrow, and follow the recipe this time." Ethan said nothing, avoiding my eyes. With Ethan working late hours, I was often alone in a house that felt suffocating. I tried to focus on hobbies and even considered joining a local art class, but Eleanor dismissed the idea. "Your place is here," she said. "There's plenty to keep you busy at home." That's when it hit me. Eleanor didn't see me as her son's wife or an equal partner. To her, I was a mistake, a disappointment who married above her station. Still, I held on to hope. I loved Ethan and believed he loved me. Surely, he would notice how his family treated me and intervene. Wouldn't he? The turning point came during a family dinner. Gerald invited a business associate, Mr. Hawkins, a wealthy and influential man. Eleanor's instructions were relentless. "Make sure the linens are perfectly pressed," she barked, "and don't embarrass us in front of Mr. Hawkins. He values class, and you're still learning." Her words stung, but I nodded, setting the table with meticulous care. When Mr. Hawkins arrived, I was introduced briefly before being banished to the kitchen. As I served hors d'oeuvres, I overheard Gerald say, "She's very lucky to be part of this family. Ethan is too kind, he could have married anyone, but he has such a big heart." The implication was clear. I was a charity case. My face burned with humiliation, but I kept my composure. After the dinner, I cleaned up alone in the dimly lit kitchen. Tears streamed down my face as I scrubbed dishes, questioning how my life had come to this. That night marked the beginning of a change, a seed of determination planted amid my despair. A week later, Eleanor summoned me to the living room. Seated on the ornate couch with a teacup in hand, she announced, "We'll be hosting Mr. Hawkins again soon. Gerald has an important deal in the works, and we must make a good impression." I nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Everything must be perfect," she replied coolly. "And this time, try not to look so plain. Presentation matters." Her words stung, but I swallowed my pride and nodded. As I walked away, The weight of their expectations pressed down on me. I wasn't their daughter-in-law. I was a pawn in their quest for social status. On the day of the dinner, I worked tirelessly from dawn. The house gleamed, the table was set with fine china, and the aroma of roasted lamb filled the air. By the time the guests arrived, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. I was utterly exhausted, but Eleanor insisted I make myself presentable. When Mr. Hawkins stepped through the door, his presence seemed to command the entire room. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried an unmistakable air of authority. His sharp eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly when they landed on me. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face, a mix of recognition and shock, but it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Dinner began, and I quietly served the courses, avoiding eye contact with anyone. When I placed a dish in front of Mr. Hawkins, he looked up and said, "Thank you, miss. Have we met before?" The question caught me off guard, and I stammered, I don't think so." He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "You look familiar." Eleanor, ever vigilant, quickly interjected, her tone sharp. "She's Ethan's wife. She tends to stay out of the spotlight." Mr. Hawkins gave a polite nod, though his expression lingered with curiosity. The rest of the meal passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me, watching, studying. The next morning, while tidying up the dining room, I heard a knock at the front door. Expecting a delivery, I opened it without much thought. To my surprise, it was Mr. Hawkins. "Good morning," he said, his tone polite but firm. "May I speak with you?" I hesitated. "Of course. Should I get Gerald?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "I came to see you." Unsure of what to expect, I led him to the sitting room, my mind racing. He sat down, his gaze unwavering. "I was up all night thinking," he began. "I can't shake the feeling that I've seen you before." I frowned, unsure where this was going. "I don't think we've met." "Perhaps not directly," he replied, pulling out his phone. "But does this look familiar?" He showed me a photograph, and my breath caught in my throat. It was my parents, younger and beaming, standing next to a much younger Mr. Hawkins at what appeared to be a formal event. How do you have this?" I whispered. "I was close friends with your parents many years ago," he said, his voice softening. "Your father and I worked together, and your mother was like a sister to me. When I saw you last night, I couldn't believe my eyes. You're their daughter, aren't you?" Tears welled up as I nodded. "Yes, but they passed away years ago." He leaned back, a mix of sorrow and relief on his face. "I had no idea. They spoke of you often, how proud they were. I lost touch with them after they moved and always regretted it." For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Mr. Hawkins' words were a lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness I'd been drowning in. He asked about my life, and though I hesitated to share too much, his genuine concern made me open up. "I'm glad I found you," he said finally. "Your parents were extraordinary people, and I owe them so much. If there's ever anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." As he left, his parting words lingered. "You deserve better than this." Those words echoed in my mind long after he was gone, offering a faint glimmer of hope. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel entirely alone. My parents' memory, through him, became a thread connecting me to something greater, a sense of belonging I'd thought was lost. Eleanor, however, wasn't blind to the change in me. One morning, as I scrubbed the kitchen counters, she approached, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You've been awfully quiet lately," she said, Not that you're one for conversation, but you seem distracted. I shook my head quickly. I've just been tired. She studied me for a moment before nodding. Well, keep your focus. We're hosting another dinner next week. Gerald's promotion depends on securing Mr. Hawkins' partnership. My heart sank at the thought of another dinner, another night of being paraded around like a servant. But then I remembered Mr. Hawkins' parting words, "You deserve better than this." A few days later, I found an envelope addressed to me on the hall table, something Eleanor or Gerald would never bother with. Curious. I opened it and was stunned to find a handwritten letter from Mr. Hawkins. I moved through the house methodically, my heart racing with every passing moment. Tonight would be my last night here. Guests began arriving, filling the air with polite chatter and laughter. Among them was Mr. Hawkins, who greeted me with a knowing smile, a silent nod to the escape plan I had so meticulously crafted. In the dining room, the clinking of glasses and hum of conversation created an elegant facade. As expected, Eleanor instructed me to stay in the kitchen, serving dishes and refilling drinks, but Mr. Hawkins wasn't one to let me linger in the shadows. "Ava," he called out as I entered the room with a platter of appetizers. "Why don't you join us? After all, we've got much to discuss." Eleanor's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Oh, there's no need for that," she said hastily, her laugh brittle. "She's here to help, not to dine." Mr. Hawkins' polite but firm tone cut through the tension. "I insist. Ava is like family to me, and I won't have her treated otherwise." The room fell silent. Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Eleanor sputtered for a response. Reluctantly, they allowed me to sit. Eleanor's glare burned into me, but I held my composure, buoyed by Mr. Hawkins' support. As the meal progressed, the conversation turned to my parents. Mr. Hawkins shared stories of them, how my father had been his closest friend and my mother's kindness had touched everyone she met. For the first time in years, they didn't feel like distant memories. In his words, they came alive again. Then, Mr. Hawkins dropped the bombshell. "Ava," he said, his voice steady and kind, "have you told them about the trust fund your parents left for you?" My heart stopped. I glanced at Eleanor and Gerald, their faces twisting from confusion to shock. "Trust fund?" Gerald echoed, his voice thick with disbelief. "Yes," Mr. Hawkins replied, his calm gaze shifting to them. "Her parents left her a considerable amount to ensure she'd never have to rely on anyone else. I'm appalled to see how that generosity has been ignored." Eleanor stammered, desperately trying to regain control. We weren't aware. She never mentioned it." Meeting her gaze for the first time that evening, I spoke calmly, my voice steady, "Because you never asked." The air grew heavy with tension. Gerald let out a nervous laugh. "Well, this is just a misunderstanding. Of course Ava will have access to her funds. Isn't that right, Eleanor?" But Eleanor's veneer cracked. "She's ungrateful," she spat, her voice shrill. "After everything we've done for her, giving her a roof, food, this is how she repays us." Mr. Hawkins' tone was resolute. "If by roof and food you mean exploitation and mistreatment, then yes, Eleanor, this is how she repays you, by reclaiming her life." For the first time, Eleanor was rendered speechless. Gerald slumped in his chair, his usual bluster drained. After dinner, I quietly gathered the bag I had packed and made my way to the door. Mr. Hawkins followed, offering me a ride to the apartment he had arranged for me through his nonprofit connections. As I left, I felt a rush of emotions: relief, empowerment, and a bittersweet sense of closure. Eleanor and Gerald didn't even try to stop me. They must have realized their grip on me was broken. The next morning, I woke up in a small but cozy apartment. My apartment. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I started attending workshops at the nonprofit, learning skills to rebuild my life. Mr. Hawkins remained a steady guide, helping me navigate the trust fund and encouraging me to pursue my dreams. Most importantly, I began to rediscover myself. I was no longer someone's servant or charity case. I was Ava, a woman with a future. Months later, I sat in a quiet cafe, sipping coffee and reading a book. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The weight of the past had lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility. I thought of my parents often, not with sadness, but with gratitude. They had given me the strength to endure, and now I was finally living the life they had envisioned for me. As for Eleanor and Gerald, I heard through the grapevine that Gerald didn't get his promotion. It seemed karma had its own way of balancing the scales, but they were no longer my concern. My life was ahead of me, and I was ready to embrace it.